Welcome to Tech Support, a podcast of the Mount Juliet Church of Christ, where we encourage and equip people to interact with the biblical text. We are your hosts, Tim Martin and Brian Lemaster.
We are continuing the series, The One They Call Christ, with today's episode looking at two titles, the Son of God and the Son of Man. We're looking at doing a part one and part two of this. Part one, we're going to be looking at this through the lens of the Gospels, and then part two, we will look at the rest of the New Testament, as well as some other things that, some early thoughts that developed about these two titles and who Jesus was, and some of the things that people argued about early on there. Tim, I want us to open up at Matthew chapter 8, and if you're don't have a Bible with you, that's all right. We won't spend too long here reading, so you should be able to follow along here. But in Matthew chapter 8, starting in verse 18, it reads, "And now when Jesus saw a crowd around him, he gave orders to go over to the other side. And a scribe came up and said to him, 'Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go.' And Jesus said to him, 'Foxes have holes, and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head.' And another disciple said to him, 'Lord, let me first go and bury my father.' And Jesus said to him, 'Follow me and leave the dead to bury their own dead.'" Then shortly after that, not too many verses later, you have where right after that Jesus calms a storm. But picking back up in verse 28, we have the story where Jesus heals two men with the demons. And in verse 29, it says, "And behold, they cried out, 'What have you to do with us, O Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time?'" So, Tim, in this only about 10 verses separation, we have these two titles that are right next to one another here. In one instance, Jesus refers to the Son of Man, has nowhere to lay his head. And then later on, you have the demons that refer to him, "O Son of God." Let's start with this first one, Son of Man. What can you tell us about that? Maybe starting with the Old Testament and working forward.
Yeah, there's definitely some origin of this in the Old Testament, and this is a topic and a phrase, both of these phrases, that has engendered a whole lot of ink being spilt about what do they mean. And so thinking about in the Old Testament, we have a few examples of that phrase. The most of them occur in the book of Ezekiel, where Ezekiel is referred to as Son of Man, like being addressed by God, for example. And most think he's just referring to Ezekiel as a human being. But I don't think it needs to be lost that Ezekiel was a mouthpiece of God. He was a prophet of God, bringing a message of God, receiving a message from God, just like Jesus brought a message here as well. And certainly we don't think Ezekiel is, deity or anything like that, but we see that. But probably the one we need to look at the most, and I think is referred to in a messianic context the most, is Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 through 14. And introducing that a little bit, Brian's going to read that. Most scholars think, or at least a lot of scholars think, that this Son of Man phrase that Jesus uses has a messianic context because of Daniel chapter 7. And nobody likes to read Daniel 7 through 12 because of these very strange apocalyptic dreams and visions. But we see in there preceding that, he has a vision, Daniel does, of the Ancient of Days. And you can read that earlier in part of chapter 7, but that's obviously referring to God. And then, as we'll see when we read these verses, one like a Son of Man, maybe you're just referring to someone in a human form, seems to be an agent of the Ancient of Days and an act on his behalf in a way that we as Christians looking back at this passage would tend to view it very messianic. And I think it's also viewed that way by the listeners of Jesus when he refers to himself in the third person as that. You want to read that, Brian?
Yeah, I'm confused. I thought Daniel stopped at chapter 6.
Yeah, nobody reads that. Lion's
right?
Den.
Yeah.
That's right. And all the pictures of Daniel in Lion's Den, he's like 15 years old, and he's really about 70-something. So, yeah, Daniel 7 is something that we need to read. And it should be, and we'll mention this later, but it's also picked up on in the Revelation that John was shown, this same type of language that's used here.
All right, here's his dream here. "I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a Son of Man. And he came to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, and all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed."
Okay, we can see where we can look back, definitely thinking about the kingdom of the church and that Jesus Christ set up. That sounds perfect. That sounds like a perfect description of Jesus Christ. And, that definitely it is one like a Son of Man. I haven't looked at the Hebrew. I think this portion's in Hebrew. Maybe it's in Aramaic, but because portions of Daniel are Aramaic, but it's not. It doesn't have the definite article. It doesn't say the Son of Man. It says one like a Son of Man, and so this perceived as being messianic by a Jewish audience of someone who's going to come up and set up an earthly kingdom, reestablish the Davidic throne along those lines. And so, interestingly enough, Jesus refers to himself a lot by that phrase. I don't know if Jesus ever calls himself the direct phrase, I am a son of God. I am the Son of God. I think we'll look at some examples where I think he answers that accordingly or acts like that accordingly. But I wrote down he refers to himself as the Son of Man no less than 20 plus times in Matthew and Luke and over 12 times in John and Mark. It's just how he refers to himself.
Is there any other places or key places in the Old Testament that uses that terminology?
We
Son
do.
of Man?
Yeah, I think Hebrews chapter 8, verses 4 through 6, looking at that. We'll look at some Old Testament things when we talk about Son of God or the concept of being in a relationship status or same nature as God when we look at some of those things in Son of God. And so I'm trying to think of anything else that I can think of other than like that psalm that's quoted by the Hebrew writer in chapter 2, verse 6. Do you have something in your mind that I'm just missing completely?
No, you mentioned the Psalms. That was one I knew you had said. So when we come to the New Testament and Jesus uses that term, Son of Man, how would that be understood?
That's the tough part. Is he and Jesus referring to himself in the third person is even weird sounding that he says that, and that Son of Man is mentioned a lot, and he clearly refers to himself even in towards his Olivet discourse as the Son of Man's will sit on the throne of judgment. And so it is a big debate about what did that mean to its ancient audience. Did they automatically hear that as Jesus inferring that I'm the Messiah? But then Jesus turns around and tells a lot of people, hey, don't go tell anybody I'm the Messiah, and go through that, and I'm the Christ. Peter acknowledges that in his great confession that we know of. And Jesus seems to be addressed or held as the Son of God by others more than he does himself, but he does mention it, as we'll talk about. But it's unclear about exactly how that would have been heard.
Yeah, I think maybe if you just saw these two terms next to one another and you think Son of Man and Son of God, you may naturally think, oh, Son of Man is all about just his humanity, and the other one's all about him being a divine person. But as we go through these like usages in the New Testament, that doesn't seem to match how that phrase is being used. So kind of keep that in mind, because I think we may have a tendency just to think, oh, Son of Man's just talking about, the human side of Jesus, and the other one's about more him being God. But as we go through here, I don't think that's actually what that term would be like highlighting there.
Based on my initial studies, and this is something people have studied for a long, long time and done a lot of writing on, it's not a prolific term in what I call intertestamental Jewish literature. It would be nice if it was all the time used, especially in Messianic, from the Dead Sea Scrolls or from the Pseudepigrapha or from the Apocrypha. If you want to know what those things are, you can go back and listen to some of our episodes about the history of the Bible. But it doesn't seem to be a prolific usage where it's very clear that says, there's no question in these people's minds when Jesus used that phrase, he is declaring himself to be the Messiah. From what I understand, it's not that prolific. And I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I'm saying it's not one of those things to where like, yes, sir, that's absolutely what it's referring to. And really, to be honest with you, neither the Son of God.
All right, can you walk us through maybe, I know you referenced like 20 times maybe Jesus has used that. You want to pick some out to walk us through that and see what is attached to that phrase when he uses it, or does it hold a certain level of like authority or anything like that with this title, Son of Man?
Yeah, I wrote down a lot of the references, but I didn't write out beside them what each one of those things were. So we just want to pick an arbitrary one?
Sure.
All right.
I love random. Just randomly, let's open the text.
Nearly 75 references here. I'm just gonna pick. All right. Then you're going to have to look it up then, if that's what you want to do. What does he say? And we're sticking the Gospels, right?
Yep.
Luke 17:22, if I can read my own sloppy handwriting here. See if that's a winner.
All right, Luke 17.
Don't read it if it doesn't have Son of Man in
it. We'll see how your notes are. All right. And he said to his disciples, the days are coming when you will desire to see one of the days of the Son of Man, and you will not see it. And they will say to you, look there, look here, Do not go or follow them. As the lightning flashes and lights up the sky from one side to the other, so will the Son of Man be in his day.
Okay, I think that's inferring to Jesus' second coming without seeing the entire context.
Yeah.
But there'll be phonies that'll come in my name in that way. And so, well, that's a good, I picked an excellent, I mean, I really knew that was.
It's used multiple times even later, like verse 30, so it'll be on that day when the Son of Man is revealed.
I've got placed 4 times in that chapter it's used that I've got written down here in chapter 17, which I didn't think about that before I mentioned it, but that's pretty big deal there to say and use that phrase in connection with his second coming, which is obviously something that's instituted by God and part of the overall plan of redemption of mankind. So he uses that phrase there. You may pick another one?
Yeah.
All right. We'll pick a different gospel. I wish I had a little spinner here. We could just pick. Let's look at John, because it'd be interesting in John's gospel, who really, really, really emphasizes Jesus' deity and being a son of God. What if we looked at chapter 6, verse 53 in John? That's right.
It's like I'm back in Bible class.
That's
you can
after
get
Luke.
to the verse.
Our listeners can't see you. Challenge. It's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. There you go.
All right. John 6:53. I'll start in 52. And the Jews then disputed among themselves, saying, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? So Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you will have no life in you.
Okay, that'd be a very weird statement. The reason I picked chapter 6 is it looks like he also uses that in verse 62 and verse 27 of the same chapter. But, that's a very weird statement right there. We would take that to be, I don't know. I don't even know. I don't know how to take that. Offhand, we think it's kind of a Lord's Supper type talk, but I'm not entirely sure that it has to be some connotation to that there, but that's a weird.
About him being the bread of life.
Yeah, obviously his listeners, that the Lord's Supper didn't exist at the time he said that. They would have thought that's a really weird thing to say in thinking through that. What does verse 62 say in that same chapter, since it's close?
Then what if you were to see the Son of Man ascending to where he was before?
Ooh.
It is the Spirit who gives life, and the flesh is of no help at all. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and life.
Well, Stephen got stoned to death for saying Jesus was standing at the right hand of God. So, okay, that's pretty big. We've chosen well randomly. Of course, everything that Jesus said about himself is pretty important, but we think here this is obviously him talking about himself going back to heaven. So once again, that's a pretty big term, and so that's interesting to think about. That the Son of Man in those instances has some sort of divine connotation as well. And I don't know everything about all messianic beliefs. Some of them do believe that it's some form of deity that comes, maybe a superhuman type individual agent of God that comes as a Messiah. Some of it was just as human being, just a plain human being. And so that's interesting. It would be neat to research him using it in those terms that wouldn't be normal for an average human being to say, I'm going to ascend back to where I came from. It'd be like, wait a minute, you didn't descend from anywhere. You're just a human being born.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's kind of why I made that comment earlier is like times where you see that being used, it's not highlighting Jesus' humanity. Like it's highlighting his authority, like those deeper concepts and like more godlike characteristics of him.
That's right. And we see that language like we'll study later in Revelation, also in the Hebrew writers. So, I don't know that we have enough information to completely figure that out. I'm sure people have done that research and maybe combed through every bit of Jewish literature and messianic expectations, but there's no question to me that it had a certain ring to his audience of inferring that. Because why use it? Especially talking about yourself in the third person all the time. Now, I think out there I've heard some arguments that Jesus was not referring to himself, but referring to some future eschatological figure. Now, that's one of those heretical type views out there, but I think he's clearly talking about himself and would assume that unless just absolutely proven otherwise. But some strange beliefs out there are that maybe he's not referring to himself, but that doesn't make any sense to me.
All right, Tim, before we move on to Son of God, you want to give just a 30-second summary of when Jesus uses that phrase, Son of God, like what should come to our minds when we see that term being used?
Does he ever use that phrase?
I meant to say Son of Man, whatever I said there.
You're confusing me.
Sorry, let me go back. When we see the term Son of Man being used throughout the Gospels, like when we read through it ourselves, what words, what ideas do we need to attach to that phrase? Or can we attach anything to it at all?
I think Messiah talk. I also think we don't dismiss the human side of it, even though it may not be simply only talking about humanity. For those who would know the Old Testament, in addition to Daniel's vision, would know that it's used so heavily of Ezekiel. I would put a prophetic messenger, mouthpiece, God spokesperson connotation to that, because that's who Jesus was. Jesus was a prophet of God, a messenger of God, but he also was God himself. And so that's why, and we're going to talk about how difficult that is to reconcile and was in early Christianity in our second episode. So we'll not go too far down that rabbit hole right now. But I think about humanity. I think about Messiah. I think about spokesperson of God.
A+ there.
Now,
Tim.
I don't know that everybody else would think about that, but of course, a lot of these people didn't understand what Jesus was saying in a lot of ways. So we don't want to assume that his audience may have been in the dark about that as well. Yeah. The ring of Daniel to it would be something we would probably be first and foremost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right, let's move on if you're ready to the phrase Son of God.
Absolutely. You tell us all about that.
All right. What do you got for us in the Old Testament? Okay,
definitely. And I'm going to talk about, we got the literal phrase Son of God, and then we have people being referred to as a son of God. In what I think is a relationship sense. I think you said it earlier when we were talking in a sense of the same nature is a good way of thinking about things, a symbolic, a status type phrase. But we do see that. We see it in some enthronement and royal passages in the Old Testament, in Isaiah 9:6, in Psalm 2:7, which is a psalm that's quoted in the New Testament, 2 Samuel chapter 7, 1 Chronicles 17, and 1 Chronicles 28. What I think I would highlight, especially in the chroniclers' writings, is when David's told, you're going to have a son that's going to sit on the you're going to have the descendant's going to sit on the throne, and he will be a son to me. And of course, it's talking about Solomon. Solomon doesn't wind up living up to that in his entire career, but this concept of a relationship between God and the king of Israel, and ultimately, I guess, the king of both Israel and Judah, as being his son. Obviously, that's not saying the same thing as the Holy Spirit's going to impregnate Bathsheba, and we know that that's not the case. David had a son with her named Solomon. That I think, and I don't think it means the same nature as God, but I think it indicates a relationship that's intimate, saying that, okay, this is the king is my son, and I think of him in a familial sense.
Would it carry with it, like I think of kind of like the parable where you send the servants and they kill them, and then you send the son. Yeah. Like, does that ring true to this situation as well, where the son carries some level of like any type of authority, or is it more just talking about a closeness?
Well, the way I interpret that parable is when Jesus says God is the vineyard owner sends his servants back. I think Jesus is talking about the prophets that were sent to Israel and Judah to ask them to repent and change. And then finally he sends his son. I think Jesus is referring to himself.
Yes, yeah. But I meant in like normal life, the son would carry more
authority.
The
heir. Well, they recognize that. Remember the people who are cheating the vineyard owner, they say, oh, here comes the heir. If we kill him, then we get, So they did recognize that.
And I'm saying would the son terminology in the Old Testament also carry with it any type of like authority or higher?
Yeah.
As opposed to just a servant, you know what I'm saying? Like,
no, you're right. I see what you're saying. Yeah, the king was definitely God's representative, and in the ancient Near East, that was believed very heavily. The king, even if it was Hammurabi, for example, the king of the old Babylonian Empire, with his deities, the king is viewed as saying, "Hey, I'm going to please the gods by keeping things in order back here, and I'm kind of the God's agent to manage people and a go-between, if you will." Some even may claim deity for themselves, like a pharaoh of Egypt, for example, being almost like a demigod status. But a king, that was like God's guy, to be, and it should have been God's guy over Israel. And if they had acted right, if all the kings of Israel and Judah had been Josiah's and Hezekiah's, it would have been a beautiful relationship. And so, I think in the ancient Near East, that would have been thought of that way as higher than a servant. A bit of higher status than a prophet or something like that, and a higher level of responsibility.
Yeah.
We also see in the Old Testament, many will remember in Genesis chapter 6, 1-4, which is a very debated passage, is the sons of God and daughters of men passages. Many people to mean that's some sort of divine beings. And we also see these phrase sons of God going to and from in heaven in Job chapter 1 and Job chapter 2 and Job 38. We see that. And so, but those are usually understood, I think, for the most part, to be created beings that are part of, we even have a divine council type format in the Old Testament. And so, but those are created beings. And I think that's something we want to see in contrast to what Jesus, the gospel writer, John especially, and then also Paul, Jesus has always been. He was the agent of creation. John talks about that in John 1. Paul talks about it with the Colossians. He's not a created being. He is the creator. And that was a big issue, but we don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole because we're going to talk about that in episode 2. If we do it now, nobody's going to listen to episode part 2.
Cliffhanger there.
That's right.
All right, so when we enter into the New Testament, like we think back to like Matthew 8 that we read, what ideas are associated with that terminology, Son of God, like when the demons referred to him or other instances here? Can you walk us through some?
Yeah, I think so. I listed some of them. I didn't do verses for all of them, but definitely I think a position of authority, of recognized deity. We think about even God referred to him as his son at Jesus' baptism, when God speaks from heaven, and also at the transfiguration with Moses and Elijah. This is my son, listen to him, he says. And so I'm not sure what John and Peter and James would have heard at that very instant. But also, as you mentioned, Satan, when he's tempting Jesus, if you are the Son of God, do this. Or you're the Son of God, do that. When he tempts, and then demons recognize him right off. They don't say, if you are the Son of God. We adjure you, Son of God, do not cast us out. Don't do the, what do you have to do with us, O Son of God? And so he's recognized, I think, as deity by those demons, and as having authority. I wouldn't be scared he could cast me out if I didn't think he could cast me out.
Yeah.
In doing that. And so I think we also see it inferred by Jesus in some of his father-son language. He doesn't say the phrase Son of God, but he says, my Father and the Son, and he refers to him. I don't really realize how much Jesus refers to himself in the third person of that. And so Mark, in a debated text in Mark chapter 1, verse 1, when it says the genesis of the gospel, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, some manuscripts say the Son of God. Now there are a pretty good balance of older manuscripts and what we would call newer manuscripts that have that. So that's a little bit of a debate about what that is. The best indication is, even if it's an addition by a later scribe or it's a variant reading, somebody thought it was very natural to put Son of God right after Jesus Christ. So that gives us a little bit of insight into early Christianity. But the angel prophesying Jesus' birth in Luke chapter 1, 32 through 35, says he's going to be the Son of God. And in some sense, I don't know if biologically is the right word, but she was inseminated by the Holy Spirit. And I don't want that to sound too weird or anything, but that's who conceived Jesus in Mary. And I'm not an expert in all that, but but he uses that phrase. John certainly asserts it in his gospel in numerous locations. And Nathaniel, remember when he said, I saw you sitting under the tree, and Nathaniel just buys right into everything. Oh, you're the Son of God because you saw me sitting under a tree. He recognizes Jesus' ability to do things supernatural and prophetic. Martha in John chapter 11, verse 27, of course, that family, Mary and Martha and I'm losing my name of Bethany, couldn't think of the name of the city, are close friends. It's their brother Lazarus that dies. They're close to Jesus. Jesus is there a lot, and they're friends. And also in some other locations. I don't know if you want me to shut up and let you talk for a second.
No,
I got a long list of some other things here.
Yeah, you keep going. There's one that I know you'll get to that I want to talk about, and that's what eventually gets Jesus in trouble.
Yeah, he somewhere along the way, there's an obvious claim that Jesus is the Son of God, because when he is in the trial at Caiaphas' house, that's the indictment. I adjure you by the God of heaven, are you the Son of God? And Jesus affirms. He says yes, and sometimes very cryptically, yes. And that's when they blow up. I mean, what else we need to say? There's blasphemy right there out of his own mouth. Obviously, that was something that was very sensitive to say. And for the claim to be, it has to be a claim of deity.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
based on their reaction.
Based on their reaction. I mean,
and their claim against him is that's a
That's it.
He has the same nature as God, or
Son of God. Right. They got just as upset when he said, "Before Abraham was, I am." Well, of course, I am has a heavy connotation going all the way back to the burning bush scene in the name of God. They wig out, when he says that and freak out. That and the gavel falls when he says to Caiaphas and the high priest there, "Oh yeah, I'm the Son of God." Well, that's it. That's all they need to think about him being crucified. And then the mockers at the cross. If he's the Son of God, he can bring himself down off that cross. So that was obviously what people thought he was, and in some way, Jesus has to have inferred that, and I think he does, has to say that. So what exactly that phrase means, though, in a messianic sense or a deity sense, is a little bit challenging. And what does that mean? He doesn't say, I am God. He said, I am the Son of God. What does that mean? We know it means a whole lot more than just a biological descendant of God.
Yeah. One thing that I find interesting, we'll talk about this next week, but Jesus uses the term Son of Man so much, but then what we say today and what we see in the second part of the New Testament here is more of the emphasis on Son of God. I can't recall a time that I've actually spoken of Jesus as the Son of Man. If I'm describing him, it's always the Son of God. So I just find that interesting. I don't know if it's because you think of it in this key moment, like at the cross and his trial and all that terminology there, but it's just interesting to see how much it's used during his life of referring to him as the Son of Man, but we really just use that second phrase for the most part. So when we think about this, obviously these titles carry a certain amount of weight and authority to who Jesus is, but we don't have to put all that just in these two terms. What else in that throughout the New Testament speaks to who he is when we think about being the Son of God, other than just that term?
Yeah, I think being equal with God or having the same authority as God, I think Jesus gives that a lot. Number one, we just talked about a second ago, before Abraham was, I am. Well, they're like, what do you mean? You're not even 30 years old before Abraham. But they definitely freak out. That has to infer that he's an eternal being, or has been. He certainly is the pre-incarnate Christ. There's a lot of that way. He didn't deny the accusation made of him when he was that way. Matter of fact, he affirmed it. I also think it's interesting that we see that Jesus has the authority to forgive sins. If you remember the paralyzed man, they're like, well, only God can forgive sins. He was like, okay, just so you know that I got the authority to do that, I'm going to tell this man to get up and walk, and he does. He also claims numerous times and infers that he has authority of eschatological judgment, meaning I'm going to be the one sitting on the judgment seat one day, the Son of the Man. And he has authority over the Sabbath day. He claims to be one with the Father. I and the Father are one. He also, I thought it was...
Pause real quick, because I know the Sabbath sometimes can be distant to us today. Why does that matter? When you think of these other things on the list,
there's two reasons given the Old Testament in Exodus chapter 20, and maybe I guess I'm on top of my head, Deuteronomy 5 or 6, is you're going to observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy. We know that way, and you're not going to do any work on the Sabbath day. The Shabbat, it's a day set aside for God for two reasons, one of which is because God ceased from his work and rested on the Sabbath day, and the second one is because I freed you from Egypt and slave. That's what you're supposed to remember. And so freedom from bondage, establishment of creation, there's a little bit there, but it says the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. He uses that Son of Man phrase, not Son of God. In doing that, that's a holy day that's reserved for God. And Jesus claims to have authority over it. It's established by God. There's no astronomical observation for a seventh day. And so it's based on everything God. God created the world, and God freed you from Egypt. And so that's a God day, to use. Maybe that's a little bit disrespectful language, but it's like a day for God. And so...
And was always there for him.
That's right.
That was a
and
constant...
It's established by God. That's right.
They didn't always practice it, but yes, that was always...
People got stoned to death for violating the Sabbath and Torah.
Yes.
And so... and thinking about that, that established in Torah, also in the Sermon on the Mount, he seems to at times take authority over the Torah. And for our audience who maybe not know that, that's the first 5 books, sometimes referred to as the law, but has a whole lot more meaning than that. He says, you have heard it said, but I say to you, and this eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. That's biblical. But Jesus seems to override that, or at least take the authority to expand upon it And then sometimes he expands on existing Jewish tradition as well. But
yeah, I was going to make that comment. Sometimes we have book, chapter, verse for some of that. Sometimes it seems to be oral tradition that he's battling there on the Sermon on the Mount. Yeah,
but he gives commandments and speaks in a way that takes authority.
Oh yes, yeah,
and gives Torah-like statements just like God would in that way. And so, yeah, we talked about forgiving sins. I think one of the interesting things in John chapter 20, verse 28, when Thomas comes and says, I don't believe unless I see his hands and see his side, and he sees that, he drops down and he acknowledges my Lord and my God. So that's the same thing in my opinion, saying my master and my deity. So right there, he's recognized as God. I mean, it doesn't say my Lord and the Son of God. It says my Lord and my God. Now, for a Jewish man to declare that of another human being, to me, is an incredibly important statement, that Thomas believed he was God, in human flesh. Michael Bird, in his, what do you call it, a systematic theology, said that Jesus was God with a human face. And I think that's a good way of saying that. So Thomas recognizes that very quickly, and I think we'll talk next episode about Paul recognizing the deity of Christ as well. But this is a big ticket item in early Christianity, and although we may take it as just second nature, that was not easily done by early Christians. It wasn't something easy to accept by Greeks and Romans either. Even in Greek philosophy, for the flesh and the divine to be combined into one thing was a strange concept to them. And to be honest with you, we might not want to admit it. It's a very strange concept to us as well, and I can't just
especially if you talk to people that didn't grow up in a Christian home. Like that's a hard thing to grasp sometimes. Like,
I mean, and even if you did grow up in a Christian home, you probably really never sat there and thought about just how strange that was. And there is one more element to Jesus' divinity that I think the Gospels give us that's maybe not even spoken words by Jesus, for example, but the New Testament narrative, for example, the Gospel narratives and specifics, because that's the only time. The things that Jesus did, okay, he raised people from the dead, he walked on water, he spoke to the stormy chaos of the sea and calmed it, and the disciples like, what is this? And then when Peter walks on water to him, they believe he's the Son of God in that way. And so the things that turn, feeding all the miracles that Jesus did, the supernatural things, they're way beyond what we see, or at least more prolific. Now, we might see that, okay, in the Elisha narratives, for example, we see some pretty supernatural things, the multiplying of food, the resuscitation of the dead, but they're greater. Jesus is greater. None of the prophets walked on water. None of the prophets, Elijah, as God's agent, caused a lengthy drought during the time of King Ahab. But Jesus has got the ability to bring somebody back from the dead, not that died a little while ago, but it's been dead for several days. And just his abilities are remarkable. So I think we also see, and I think you referred to something about this. You said that you had read. I'll let you say it.
Yeah, that was actually what I was about to say. That I forget who said it, but I was listening to somebody and they said, Mark doesn't define what the Son of God means there when he opens up the book there, but pretty much the gospel shows us what that means. Yeah. Just through all the acts and what you're talking about, the miracles and all these things. We don't get this like crystal clear definition of this is exactly what it means, but we get multiple chapters that show us this is who the Son of God is. Like,
and that he is divine. Now, I do think, and we'll talk about this some next week, and this is a struggle. It's one thing to say that Jesus was divine, like we would say. Somebody say, okay, well, then he was like an angel. It's another thing to say he had equality with God. Those are two concepts that are separated. We have angels that come to the earth that interact with human beings, like those who went to Lot's house, for example, in the Old Testament. Whoever it was, it's a debate about who was Jacob wrestling with. And so we see Gabriel or Michael come and speak to someone. Those are all divine beings to Mary and to Elizabeth.
But it goes back to that authority.
Yeah, the authority is what's different in doing it. And not to say that no angelic beings, we definitely see that in the visions of the apocalypse, that angelic beings and heavenly beings seem to speak with some authority and some decision-making, but they ain't an angel that's ever claimed to forgive sins, okay, or any kind of being. They're usually just acting out whatever God's told them to act out. And so that's a really good point. The authority that Jesus assumes over Torah, over nature, over sin, over disease, over death, that's not just any divine being. That's not just some created divine being.
Yeah. Hey, as we wrap this up, you got any other closing thoughts, or was that it?
No, I'm just trying to refrain from saying anything about next week as we go through to that. But I think what we're going to talk about is Jesus in the later Jesus' divinity and Son of God concept. The Son of Man thing seems to kind of disappear other than in Revelation. But what Paul and other New Testament, in the later New Testament, have to say, early Christian heresies about Jesus' divinity. And I think we're going to also maybe look at some later literature maybe about Jesus being the Son of God. But just that is the core thing of all of Christianity. So, and we'll talk a little bit about the word begotten that's in some English translations. I did some research on that during my schoolwork, and so that's a good discussion to have. That he's different than angels, very different than angels.
Join us next week for that discussion. If you got any questions or suggestions for future topics, let us know by emailing us at podcast@mountjuliet.org. To our fellow students of Scripture, thank you for joining us for tech support. We hope you will join us next week.
This is a podcast of the Mount Juliet Church of Christ. You can find more personal growth resources like this one at mountjuliet.org/resources. The Mount Juliet Church of Christ exists to glorify God and make disciples by helping people grow in Christ, love one another, and serve others.